Hello and welcome to this, our third lecture in our third week for Management 301. This one is about managing decision making. So we've talked a bit about the decisions that are made, and now we're going to go a little bit more into the practical application of, well, what are the processes that we can use to improve, hopefully, decision making? Also, a little bit of reality, what are the ways that decisions often get made and maybe aren't ideal? So we'll discuss what kind of decisions do we even make? What do we mean when we talk about decision making in a managerial context? What is the rational perspective, or the what you might call the ideal perspective, about how managers should make decisions? And then how do managers actually often make decisions in reality? What are the behavioral aspects, including behavioral biases that can influence decision making? How do teams make decisions, or what are some of the group and team ways to make decisions, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of some of those group-based methods? So decision making is simply choosing from among a set of alternatives. Even sometimes the alternative is to do nothing and we choose that. Sometimes to not make a decision really is also a decision. Um, the process essentially involves, when it's active, involves recognizing and defining the nature of decision, identifying what the alternatives are for the decision space, you might call it, within this decision we need to make. What are the different alternatives that are available to us, and then choosing the best alternative, and of course, implementing it or putting it into practice. The best alternative is the one that is most effective, presumably at achieving whatever our strategic objectives are that we have set, or our goals as an organization. Uh, Effective decision making requires that the decision maker actually understands the situation. So there's an external aspect, as always, and an internal aspect, and the decision maker, or the manager in our discussion here, has to be able to correctly analyze and evaluate the situation that is driving that decision. Most decisions fall into one or two categories. The program decisions, which are generally recurrent and oftentimes have some form of predictability about them, things that you know are going to happen. And you might say that program decisions can often be planned for because we can expect that the situation will arise. And there's non-program decisions. They're unstructured, more ad hoc. Maybe this could be for good reasons or bad reasons. We need to choose a vacation destination, or we need to respond to a crisis. Another way to think about decisions, the programmed, or non-programmed, but also the conditions that inform the decision-making situation involve certainty, risk, and uncertainty. These three categories come from a book by, I believe, an economist called Frank Knight, who wrote a book called, what was it? Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit. I actually have a copy of the book here, but I can't see it right now. But I think the book was called Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit. And essentially, we'll dig into each one of these, what exactly it means regarding the ambiguity of our context, going from certainty, which is obviously the lowest ambiguity. We know what's going to happen with certainty. Now, of course, it's never really certain, but it's the highest level of certainty, you might say. Risk is, well, we have an idea about the probability that something will happen that's reliable, right? Flipping a coin. If we're betting on that, well, pretty reliably 50% of the time. If we flip a coin 1,000 times, we're probably going to get heads fairly close to 500 times with a bit of a variation. And then uncertainty, we don't even know what the distribution is, right? We don't even know how many sides there are on this coin. Back to that statement about unknown unknowns that I mentioned in a previous lecture. So certainty, we can be pretty sure about the conditions that are going to prevail. As it says there, few decisions are made under conditions of true certainty. The sun will rise tomorrow is about as much certainty as we can have, right? It's about as certain as it gets. What goes up must come down. Sort of laws of nature are the most certain. As soon as we add some people to the mix, everything becomes less certain quite quickly. But we still talk about these certain things as having there being a state of certainty. The United States will exist next month and be the business environment in which we're operating, we could say, is very certain. States of risk. Now it's not certain, but we have a fairly well understood payoff and probability structure. This would really play into things like financial risk, especially as you get into large, and what I mean by that is sort of stock performance, or the risk of loans or insurance risk, right? Insurance companies are able to stay profitable because they have a fairly reliable probability distribution for the various types of payouts you're going to have to make, and they can price that risk accordingly. That's the big thing about this category of risk. You can price risk. You know the distribution. As a banker at Bank of Montreal, my credit department knew the risk of default, was able to assess that for not for every single loan, but they could have sort of a fairly reasonable guess for each loan. They'd assign it a risk rating, and then once you aggregate that into a huge pool of millions of loans, you can get fairly statistically precise, or at least precise enough to run a profitable business. You don't lose more money, hopefully, than you make on your loans. You can assign high interest rate to risky loans, low interest rate to less risky loans, because you know that distribution. Now, when you get into uncertainty, you simply don't even know what the probability distribution is. There's unknown unknowns. There's risks that you haven't even identified yet or aren't even aware of. Risks probably aren't the right word here because we've given that term a technical definition, but there are events that you aren't even aware of that could impact what you're trying to do. This is where we get really into this idea of it management being more of an art than a science. I believe I'm right in saying that Frank Knight, in his book Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit, essentially said that really a lot of entrepreneurial activity is about deploying resources in uncertain situations and having sort of an intuition. Good entrepreneurs are able to deal with this uncertainty and are successful in uncertain circumstances. So two models of decision making. The classical decision model, this is sort of the decision model that arises and upon which classical economics are based. And the idea here is that individual actors make the best decisions, rational decisions, utility maximizing decisions on the basis of having complete information and processing that information optimally. Right? It assumes decision makers have complete information about the surroundings, but not only that, they've evaluated that information logically and rationally, i.e. correctly, and they can effectively eliminate uncertainty as assumed in those two factors. So here's a little graphic, right? And notice there in italics, it says, when faced with a decision, a manager should, this being the ideal case, obtain complete information, perfect information, eliminate uncertainty, and evaluate everything rationally and logically. And what will the outcome be? The best possible situation. Doesn't mean it's a good. It doesn't mean it's a good decision, but it's the best decision. So the classical model of decision making assumes that managers always make the optimal decision. It's the same thing with classical economics. It assumes you as the customer know all the prices in the market and choose the best option for your whatever your set of constraints are. You make a rational decision based on perfect information. So here's a further example of that. First thing, when we're talking about managers faced with a decision, well, they look at the alternatives and evaluate the alternatives one by one. Is the alternative feasible? No? Okay, we're getting rid of that alternative. If it is, all right. Is it satisfactory? Does it meet the requirements we've set for us? No? Well, then it's not a good alternative. Yes, we go on to the next stage of decision making. Are the alternatives consequences affordable? Can we implement this alternative based on our resources? No? Well, then there's no point thinking about it. Yes? Okay. Well, this goes into what you might call the maybe pile, that's how we whittle down our alternatives till we're left with the optimal alternative for our decision that we're facing. This is the rational model. It says so right here. There we go. All right. Here's those steps outlined again in some more detail. I won't go through them all here, but now we're including evaluating those alternatives that we've selecting the best alternative and even implementation, and then reevaluating those results, right? This kind of feeds back into what we might do the next time we're faced with a similar decision. Implementation, as always, as with planning, is difficult. In all forms of decision making, it's always the implementation that can lay waste to the best made plans. So it says, assume there's going to be resistance from employees due to a number of reasons: insecurity, I don't know how to do this; inconvenience, I don't want to do this; and fear of the unknown. This is just a completely new experience for me, and that can be scary. Even after implementation has begun, things don't always go to plan. Costs might increase. The decision we made might not be the perfect fit for our organization, or we may run into other issues. As those costs go up, all of a sudden now we're having cash flow problems, or we're not generating revenues from that decision as quickly, or generating cash. Maybe we're generating revenues, but we're not collecting on those sales quickly enough. We're selling on account, whatever, and all sorts of problems that can arise even once you're implementing the decision. Afterwards, using this rational decision-making model, let's do a follow-up, a debrief, and you'll have this if you do project management or you implement policy decisions. How did it work? Did we like it? Let's have a debrief, or even a post-mortem. Sometimes they'll call it, slightly with a bit of a dark sense of humor. How did it work? Is there anything we want to change? Did it serve its purpose? Should we do the same thing again, maybe with some minor adjustments based on the context, or should we completely scrap it? It didn't work. We'll do something different next time. That's the last step in our rational decision making. And continuing in this ideal situation, how you should do things, and the rational method is the best method to follow. Now, of course, the reality is we don't have perfect information, but it's still a useful model because it's still the best tool we have, right? He made the best decision with the information he had at the time, is something we'll say, and generally we mean he did the right thing. He used this rational decision model with the information that he or she had, and that's the best we can hope for. And part of that rational decision making means using evidence-based management. This is a term that's being used increasingly, and the idea here is we don't make our decisions based on gut feelings or our intuitions. As much as possible, we look to see, well, we do some research. Do we have any statistical evidence about similar situations and the sorts of decisions that are effective versus ineffective? Maybe all we have is our own, if we don't have much, if it's an uncertain situation, well, maybe all we're doing is accumulating our own evidence, but at least have we evaluated those like we talked about and made some assessments about whether it was a good decision or a bad decision? Let's use the evidence. Let's look back at the evidence available and decide what is, statistically speaking, if you like, the most likely decision to succeed, or the most likely alternative to be successful. So the rational perspective, increasingly in the era of big data, there's almost always going to be some kind of evidence available from somewhere that can help you inform a decision, give you some indication of which alternatives may have a higher or lower likelihood of being successful. That's what evidence-based decision making is always is about. It doesn't mean you're always going to be right. It doesn't mean you have a guaranteed silver bullet, but you can improve your assessment of the probability of success based on information about other decisions that have been made and used similar alternatives. And this is especially useful for critiquing maybe intuitive ways of doing things, methods of decision making that have just assumed to be the best that aren't. For example, pay for performance, right? Performance-related pay, it turns out, tends to work quite well in individual style tasks. Maybe you've got a sales team that works independently, they're out on the road, and that's a very good way to motivate staff. But it turns out that performance-related pay can be counterproductive in team settings. You end up with individuals who are performing better than the rest, and it actually can be quite divisive because they aren't being rewarded as a team, and the incentives aren't aligned well if you're giving different amounts of reward to different members of the team, or if maybe you can have subtle variations, but great if one of the team members you're rewarding with 10 times the salary of another team member, and yet they're supposed to be equal in terms of their hierarchy on the team. That's going to create divisions and destroy the cohesion of that team, according to evidence-based management, which may be contradicting an assumption that a manager has that performance-related pay is always the best option. What are the 5 principles of EBM? First of all, you may need to face some uncomfortable truths, face the hard facts, and develop a culture where people give you feedback. If we're doing the wrong thing and somebody on the line is seeing that something's not working, our sales staff are getting feedback from our customers that they don't like something about our product, are we cultivating a culture in the firm as managers where that feedback can be delivered and we can get this new information, even if it's personally unpleasant, or do we hide everything under the carpet? Do we allow the facts to rule our decision making? If somebody can present evidence that says there's a better way to do something, are we going to allow that to guide our decisions? Do we cultivate a management culture that says, show me the evidence and I'll change my mind, right? Change my mind, show me the evidence, and I'll change my position. Are we teachable as an organization and as a management team? We need to treat the organization, it says, as an unfinished prototype. Do we think we've already arrived? Are we perfect? No, we're not. So we're always evolving, always learning, always improving. Sometimes you hear this called continuous improvement, right? Do we have a culture of continuous improvement? Do we always look at the plus, the pros and the cons, even the best plan, even the best option, even the best outcome probably had some downside to it. There was a decision we made and we had to balance some competing. We chose one route. That means we probably chose not to do something else. So there was probably something sacrificed, even if it was still the best decision. And what were those drawbacks? And what were the risks? Even though the decision may have proven to be successful in this instance, could it have gone otherwise? And were we honest about those risks? And do we need to keep those risks in mind? Perhaps next time we face the same situation and we have the same alternatives and we choose the same decisions or the same alternative, maybe it won't necessarily work out the same way. It was a risky alternative. It paid off this one time, but there's a 50-50 chance next time it doesn't pay off and that it fails. Oftentimes, that's a source of severe bias. We use a certain intuitive method of decision making. Oh, it works I always choose this way. It always works for me until it doesn't, right? What was the risk? What was the actual probability it would have succeeded? And that feeds into this final here part of strongly held beliefs, right? I've always done it this way, or this is how the winners do, this is the winning strategy. Well, what's the evidence for that? Back it up with some evidence. If you don't have evidence for your strongly tested belief, right? And this is the same, this goes for academic, for your work in this course. Don't just state an argument as if it was true because it was common sense. Common sense can be dangerous. Sometimes it's a good place to start, but back it up, right? A lot of what passes for common sense turns out not to be supported when we actually look at how it plays out over the long term. My common sense and your common sense may not agree with each other, and maybe you have better evidence for your common sense, and I need to look at that evidence and realize I have less evidence. So watch out for this is the big part here. It's untested. Find evidence for it. Now, so this has been talking about the rational model, the ideal, the smart way of doing things, evidence-based management. But if we're talking about, well, obviously there's a lot of bad decisions that get made out there. How does that happen if they're making these optimal decisions? Well, a guy called Herbert Simon comes along and he says, yeah, we talk about it and this is what they should do, but what actually happens a lot of the time? Well, the fact of the matter is we don't have perfect and complete information. We almost always have incomplete, imperfect information. Moreover, we don't assess that information perfectly. We have something, he calls it bounded rationality. So he doesn't say we're completely bonkers, that managers are crazy and they're idiots. He says, well, they're limited human beings with limited cognitive abilities, even if they're comparatively very skilled, but it's bounded. So they operate in a way that's as rational as possible, you might call it. They're trying to be rational, but they only have so much processing power when they're analyzing this incomplete and imperfect information. That's the reality, he says. And what happens? Well, and actually, they don't keep searching till they find the best possible optimal alternative. They find one that is good enough, and they move on. Right? I had a friend in England that always used to say, "Good enough is good enough." Right? And oftentimes, what's implied there is sometimes you just have to make a decision and move on. And actually, sometimes satisficing, right? It's sufficient, it's satisfactory, and it suffices. Oftentimes, that is the correct way to make the decision. If it's a decision that's only worth about an issue that's only going to cost $20 and I'm getting paid $50 an hour, well, I shouldn't be spending a whole hour trying to figure out a solution to a $20 problem. So this doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. It just means we shouldn't assume that the manager is going to continue devoting unlimited resources to finding the optimal solution that they will arrive at every time. That's kind of continues to be outlined here. Minimum standard. Doesn't necessarily, I don't think it always is the minimum. Well, it says it meets some minimum standard. So we have an idea about what we want to achieve. It's kind of like if you're going out to buy a car maybe and you say, this is my target price, and you stop looking when you hit that target price. Maybe there was a car that you could have gotten even more cheaply, but you didn't know that. It was limited information and you satisficed. So which of these models is right? Well, as we showed, this is a great way to form a plan of attack for making decisions, right? I'm going to get as much information as possible. I'm going to try for perfect information, and I'm going to try to evaluate it accurately. Now, the fact of the matter is, the administrative model tells me it'll never be perfect information, and I'll never evaluate it perfectly, which can help us be realistic, you might say, in our expectation for decision making. We don't fire someone because they didn't perfectly predict the external environmental conditions for the next year. Right? So this is ideal, this is real, and it's good to have both. Maybe sometimes we get pretty darn close to the ideal. We get really good information, we're able to assess it quite accurately, perfect. Sometimes it's further away from that. Reality sets in. Both useful perspectives. They're not in competition with each other. Unless you're trying to predict how humans will behave, in which case it's fairly well proven that the administrative model makes a pretty useful adjustment. And it's not like I said, it assumes still that people want to be rational. It makes that assumption that obviously there's lunatics, or sometimes we act in a way that is not rational, right? We all have those moments, but for the most part, if you're looking in aggregate, people will tend to behave in a way that is trying to be rational. They're boundedly rational. So here's that written out here. I'll let you guys look at this on your own, but the key word here is this actually. This is, at first it was how they should act, and this is what they actually do, according to Herbert Simon and the administrative model. Oops. So, other factors that can play into less than rational decision making, well, sometimes you have political forces at play. Sometimes this is called we talk about legitimacy. Decisions are made not because they're the most rational decision, but because they're the most socially acceptable or they're the most socially legitimate. This is sometimes called the institutional approach to management. In terms of now we're trying to explain why people make the decisions they actually do rather than how. Nobody thinks, I generally would say, no economist is going to say, or even no management scholar is going to say, go and make the decision that is the most politically popular and don't stick your neck out. They're going to say, make the right decision. But the fact of the matter is oftentimes we have biases. One of those biases might be we're part of a faction. We might not call it that, but we have our friends or we have our people that we work with that form groups. Maybe they're groups related to our particular function in the organization or a particular place in the hierarchy. And we end up working towards a particular goal related to our function. And this can be positive or negative. It's basically like saying that there's peer pressure. Peer pressure can impact the decisions we make in the organization. And just like maybe if you have children, you can think about sometimes peer pressure is good. Or if you're a teacher, right? Maybe the peer pressure is positive. It's a baseball team, and the kids all want to work to achieve their best and be respectful, and nobody wants to, or in a classroom, there's a bit of healthy competition where students want to achieve and do well, or it can be negative. Maybe the general culture is toxic and not directed towards positive pursuits, but it's distracting. So sort of this group effect or political bias in decision making isn't necessarily positive or negative. It depends on the context. So managers, and sometimes it's necessary. Sometimes for decisions to be effective, coalitions need to be formed. We see this in politics all the time, hence the political nature. And if we want to get something done and we believe it's in the organization's best interest, maybe we need to form some coalitions to move things in the right direction, whilst constraining the dysfunctional. We want to, at the same time, avoid something called groupthink that we'll look at in a minute here. Other behavioral biases. So there's kind of the group bias related to the politics, right? We form groups, we form coalitions, and we want to defend our group, even if maybe it's not the best for the organization. We want to defend our chosen decision. Sometimes there's just these intuitions, right? For whatever reason, the way we were raised, we prefer certain alternatives, or we attribute merit to certain alternatives without evidence. This is not using evidence-based decision making. This is the opposite. There's also something called escalation of commitment. This is sort of that idea of doubling down, or sometimes it's called throwing good money after bad when it refers to an investment. But we've become so committed to a decision we've already taken that we find it very hard to abandon it, even when it's quite clear that we made the wrong decision. We keep doubling down on that decision, and there's just a real human bias to because just to stop would be to admit that we were wrong. We don't want to admit that we were wrong. It's easy just to keep pushing in that direction and hope nobody says anything, and maybe if we're really lucky, it'll turn out right in the end. These are human what you might call cognitive or behavioral biases that inhibit good decision making, impair good decision making. So know about them, manage them. You can take steps to avoid them. Have someone who gives you feedback on your ideas. Try to make evidence-based decision making rather than intuitive, and have someone that you trust or some kind of procedures whereby there can be feedback that tells you if something's not working, and plans for how to de-escalate that commitment if you need to. There's also risk propensity. Sometimes people may be very low risk propensity, and actually being too low risk or having a very low appetite for risk can lead to poor decisions, right? Maybe the right decision takes a riskier route, but that payoff ratio is the right one. If I don't want to get in a car accident, I'll stay home and stay in bed. For most people, that's not the right decision. We need to accept some level of risk, no reward. And in business, of course, every decision has some level of risk. But at the same time, a high risk propensity can lead to great losses. And sometimes there's an irrational desire for risky behavior. Gamblers love risk. Gamblers have a risk appetite that's not rational. They choose, they place bets, right? It's I hate to break this to you guys, but playing the lottery is not a positive expected return, is what you might say. You are paying your investment in a lottery ticket is not proportional to the expected payoff, because somebody's taking half that money, or however much. When you go to the casino, the house always wins. People gamble because they like the risk. They are unrealistic about their opportunities of winning. Gambling is a perfect example where the risk appetite is too high, because the expected payoff, the likelihood that you will win in proportion to how much you invest, is always negative. Otherwise, the house wouldn't make any money. Yeah, so both neither of them are good. At the same time, low propensity risk. You're unwilling to invest in a opportunity that has a positive expected return, right? Even if you have to put some money up, the potential upside outweighs or is better equal to or better than the amount you have to pay for that opportunity. So another area of potential bias is risk propensity. Ethics form another part, and this is kind of another um, dimension of decision making. Not so much is it will it optimize whatever our goal is, our outcome? Will it make us more money or less money? But also ethics play into this. Sometimes the decision that will make the most money for the firm violates ethics, which means it violates another value that is maybe equally or more important than the financial outcome. If you can have a positive net value proposition that involves um, giving a million customers cancer, well, that might be the most financially lucrative alternative, but it is unacceptable because of its violation of ethics and the other costs. So almost all decisions are going to have some ethical components. Some of them are more or less ambiguous than others. Should we paint the house blue or red has less of an ethical implication probably than um, should I smoke in a restaurant? Not that that's legal anymore. Um, right. And our ethics will also, I mean, the fact of the matter is people have different ethical frameworks. Someone thinks it's okay to lend an interest. Someone thinks it's not. Often this is very much due to wider cultural influences. And those will lead to those will frame the acceptable decision alternatives. So that's another way. I wouldn't necessarily call this a bias, but it's a behavioral component of decision making. We bring our own ethics, which will broaden or constrain what is the acceptable set of alternatives and what success looks like. So, um, what are the different forms of group or group and even team decision making? Just it may be group decision making, but not team based, or it might be group decision making and team based. What do I mean by that? Well, we might be making it as an interacting group. We sit together around a table, right? This is, I think, what most people think of when they think about group decision making. We have a committee. Maybe we have some different um, uh, sort of steps in that or form a formalized process for making decisions as a group, but in some way or another we have come to decision as a group. Maybe it's through a vote, maybe and it's just sort of 50-50, anything over 50%, that's the decision we go with. Maybe it has to be a unanimous decision, but we do it as a group. Delphi decision making is slightly different. This is where the opinion it's not democratic. We go straight to the experts, right? Maybe we have a problem to do. I've heard about this with R&D projects, for example. Well, we're going to go to our best physicist, our best engineer, or our best 7 physicists and ask them for their opinion. And then we sort of tally these up and sort of the average of those opinions is what we'll decide to go with, something that can be identified as a consensus of those opinions. They don't talk to each other normally in a Delphi group. In fact, as a Delphi group generally would not consult with each other. We would solicit their opinions independently and then collate those ourselves into a group average and go with it's called Delphi. It's talking about the Oracle of Delphi, sort of these I think it was ancient Greece, you'd go and consult the oracle. And so that's where this comes from, the oracle at Delphi or Delphi, not sure which. Then we have something called a nominal group, um, which is we're going to use multiple inputs from multiple people, but they're not going to arrive at the same decision. They don't, and they're not expected to. We just use that group to generate creative and innovative alternatives. It's kind of like brainstorming, you might say, but without the commitment to any of one of their ideas. Maybe I'm the CEO and I consult a group, but I don't make any commitment to actually go with what they come up with. That would be a nominal group. It's a group in name only. They don't actually determine the eventual decision in terms of authority. There's advantages and disadvantages. The advantages are, of course, 2 heads are better than one, right? We get more information, more knowledge, more perspectives, hopefully generate things that almost certainly we generate more alternatives because there's more processing power, more brains. Another big benefit is, especially if the group feels like they contributed and had ownership of that decision, implementation is probably going to be easier because they're going to accept it. It was, I always say that try to convince them that it was their idea, right? If it was the group's idea and the group generally feels that they came to that conclusion in a fair way and they contributed to it, it's going to be a lot easier to get buy-in. It may improve the communication of that decision. You're more likely to remember the outcome of that decision if you were part of the body that came to that decision. And generally, it's fairly well proven that uh, when decisions are generated with consultation amongst multiple individuals, you're less likely to have any one extreme opinion or extreme view dominate. You're going to arrive at something that's statistically closer to whatever the right decision is. There's some really interesting research on this, even things like you get a group in a room to guess the weight of a cow. Using a picture of a cow. I did this in a finance class. And if you take the average of everyone's guesses, assuming maybe you need to get rid of the outliers, anybody who says something completely ridiculous, but if you find a way to take the average of that, you arrive very close, it turns out, at the actual weight of the cow, or in the case of a decision, at hopefully the best decision. The disadvantages, it is not a quick way. If you're dealing with a group of people, it's going to take a long time. These are people you are probably paying for their time, so it's going to be costly, both in terms of time and money. Sometimes it leads to a compromise decision in a situation where a compromise isn't effective. You see this with political systems when you sort of political systems that don't have just a clear two-party system, and you end up with a sort of five parties in a coalition, and they can't decide anything, and they can't even form a government. Say, I think that is probably in Belgium a couple years ago. I think they had one in France recently. We might have this in Canada right now, even my home country. It can result in indecisiveness and an inability to make any decision at all. You might have a dominant party. You think it's a group decision, but it's actually just not a group decision. It's one person imposing their biases if they're a particularly strong personality or there's a particularly unbalanced power dynamic. And then you end up with the same problems as just it not being a group decision at all. Or you can have group-related biases. People don't want to have conflict, especially if the structure and the personalities are such that they try to avoid conflict. And then you can end up with this thing called groupthink, where you arrive at a terrible decision, but nobody wanted to say anything, nobody wanted to disagree. People also have a tendency, if I see somebody else saying something and everybody else is it's classic tale of the emperor, the emperor's new clothes, right? Everybody says the emperor has clothes. I don't want to stick out. If everybody says they see his nice clothes, then I'm just going to assume he must have some nice clothes on, and I just don't see it. That's groupthink. So advantages and disadvantages. Right. And those are kind of outlined and it talks about groupthink a bit more here. Lots of great examples of that in the literature. Deepwater Horizon was an example where at every stage, safety indicators, there were red flags everywhere, but at each stage, everybody assumed, well, the guy before me said it was fine, so it must be fine. And of course, it wasn't fine. Systems failed. Same thing with NASA Challenger. Groupthink is a really dangerous cognitive bias. And a downside to group decision making. You need to have methods in place to challenge groupthink. Maybe you have outsiders from the group that you then allow to criticize or test those decisions that are derived at by a group to avoid groupthink in the same way you would if you were just having one individual make a decision. Get somebody external to critique that and provide insight and avoid biases. Good. Yeah, some basic ideas here for making good decisions and ways to manage group decision making. If you're aware of the risks, groupthink, dominant personalities, you can manage it, right? Be careful how you structure a group. If you think somebody's going to dominate, maybe you need to set some ground rules that allow quieter people to have a voice. If you're worried about timeline, maybe you have to set procedures with deadlines that force a decision point. I covered this one already, dominant members. Provide a structure that allows each group or team member to have an input. Uh, yeah, if there's a power dynamic, right, everyone's boss. Uh, don't reveal your cards. Otherwise, what's going to happen if you cast your vote too early as the dominant person in the room? People might want to curry favor, consciously or unconsciously. Your staff might want to agree with you. Um, Maybe you assign someone, I like this one, you assign someone the role of devil's advocate, right? Make it someone's job to pick apart the decision that's arrived at. We have something called an adversarial legal system for this reason. We make it someone's job uh, to defend the defendant, right? We don't assume in our legal system that um, the judge just says whatever he decides beforehand and reveals his decision. The two parties have to go head to head and fight it out. And we hope that the truth is revealed through this conflict. It's not just one person presenting the case with no criticism. We want someone to play devil's advocate and pick apart the argument. And if the argument still stands after it's been challenged, then maybe it's a pretty good argument and we might arrive at the truth. If it falls apart as it's picked away at in our adversarial law system, then it served its role and actually it wasn't as strong as maybe initially was thought. Same reason we have that debate structure for debating ideas. And then whole follow-up, right? We all stayed up till midnight last night having this group decision, and we arrived at a decision. Let's hold a follow-up meeting to make sure we still think it was a good decision sort of a week later. Has any new information come about? Have we cooled off a bit after a long session? Have a follow-up. Good. I believe, yeah, this is the end of our third lecture for week 3. Looking forward to seeing your guys' discussions about these topics on Packback and seeing you all next week.